Hello, my name is Dennis Halandzovskyi. Here is a clear, verified rundown of what is coming next week from Brussels and why it matters beyond headlines. The European Commission is preparing to present the 19th package of EU sanctions against Russia at the start of next week, after briefing member state ambassadors on the outline and taking cues from a meeting of G7 finance ministers. In parallel, Washington is pushing partners to tighten the economic vice. The US Treasury has urged the G7 and the EU to consider steep, time-limited tariffs on goods from China and India because their purchases of Russian crude are helping to bankroll Moscow's war. The idea under discussion is simple, even if the politics are hard. Raise costs on those who sustain the Kremlin's oil revenue and lift the tariffs the day the war ends. If you find this useful, please subscribe to the channel and like this video. And thank you to all of Ukraine's partners for your continued help and support. Let's set the stakes in practical terms. Sanctions are not just a press release, they are a system. Packages in 2022 through 2025 have targeted banks, technology, shipping, the so-called shadow fleet, energy revenues, and military supply chains. Each new package tries to close loopholes that traders and intermediaries exploit. The 19th round is expected to dig deeper into oil logistics and financial channels, with a sharper focus on enforcement and anti-evasion. Even before the new package lands, the EU has just renewed thousands of individual listings, asset freezes and travel bans, which keep pressure on the networks that handle money, parts, and influence for Russia's war. Why now? Three reasons are converging. First, Russia is leaning harder on drones, missiles, and long-range logistics to pressure Ukraine and intimidate Europe. Cutting revenue and parts makes those operations costlier. Second, after months of cat and mouse with ship-to-ship transfers and so-called dark fleet tankers, regulators have better data and a longer list of repeat offenders to go after. Third, the US push on tariffs, controversial but limited to the wartime window, creates leverage in G7 capitals that want results without permanent trade breaks. Here is the bottom line for viewers. Expect headlines about sanctions number 19, but look for the substance underneath. Tighter controls on oil flows, stricter banking measures, and coordinated enforcement with allies. The goal is straightforward: shrink the money and materials fueling Russia's aggression, protect European security, and support Ukraine's ability to fight and recover. In the next blocks, I will break down likely components, the politics of getting 27 EU members to agree, and how the G7 tariff debate could accelerate or reshape Europe's approach. Let's unpack what the 19th package is likely to include, based on recent signals, and why these details matter for results, not rhetoric. First, oil logistics and the shadow fleet. Expect tighter rules that make it harder to sell Russian crude and products above the G7 price cap by using shell companies, flag hopping, and opaque insurance. Europe learned across earlier rounds that paperwork alone is not enough. Enforcement needs shared data and real consequences. Second, financial channels. New measures could hit banks and payment intermediaries that facilitate sanctions evasion, expand restrictions on Russia's mere payment system, and target niche services that move money for procurement networks. Cutting those pipes slows purchases of electronics, optics, machine tools, and drone components that Russia still tries to source via third countries. Third, export controls. Expect additional dual-use items, tighter catch-all rules for suspicious buyers, and more pressure on intermediaries in the Caucasus, Central Asia, the Gulf, and parts of East Asia. Fourth, named entities and individuals. The EU has already prolonged listings for thousands of people and companies. A fresh tranche can add logistics firms, traders, and defense producers tied to the war effort. Fifth, maritime services. Inspections and penalties will likely tighten for ship-to-ship transfers in known hotspots and for vessels that misdeclare cargoes to dodge the cap. Now the politics. Sanctions require unanimity among 27 member states. Some governments want to move faster, others, like Slovakia's coalition under Robert Fico, signal conditions or exceptions. This is where the transatlantic context matters. Washington's push for wartime tariffs on China and India over purchases of Russian oil raises leverage in G7 capitals and emboldens EU hawks who argue that soft enforcement just subsidizes the Kremlin. Italy's Foreign Minister Antonio Tajani has framed the goal clearly: a package that hits financial flows hard, Meanwhile, the Commission's sanctions envoy, David O'Sullivan, is in Washington with experts to coordinate details. The Commission spokespeople confirm the work is ongoing, but have not published the final list. If talks go smoothly, we could see ambassadors take this up midweek, with national legal services polishing the text before publication in the EU's official journal. A further lever is asset use, expanding the windfall scheme from frozen Russian sovereign assets to fund Ukraine's defense and reconstruction. That debate is separate from sanctions but interacts with them. As pressure narrows Russia's revenue, stable funding for Ukraine strengthens deterrence. On the maritime side, expect more naming and shaming of tankers and service providers coordinated with insurers in London and Piraeus, so that repeat offenders lose cover and financing. How will this affect Ukraine, Europe, and ordinary people, and when would we see results? Start with Ukraine. Stronger enforcement on oil revenues and procurement networks directly reduces the resources Russia can throw at missile and drone production and at buying foreign components. That does not stop attacks overnight, but it tightens the logistics pipeline that keeps Russia's long-range strikes going. It signals sustained resolve for Ukraine's planning and for partners repairing grids, rail, and ports. Next, Europe. Energy markets have already adjusted to years of sanctions. The big shock was in 2022. Today, the risk is less about sudden price spikes and more about keeping enforcement tight enough that the shadow fleet cannot quietly rebuild margins by cheating the price cap. In recent months, targeted actions against non-compliant tankers and service providers have shrunk the easy arbitrage. Package 19 should deepen that trend. For businesses and consumers, the practical effect is mostly invisible. Compliance officers and insurers do the heavy lifting, unless you touch trade lanes linked to sanctioned firms. Where the costs are real is on Russia's side: longer routes, higher insurance, worse financing, and more seizures. Now, the US tariff debate, tariffs on China and India would be a separate wartime tool aimed at behavior change, reduce purchases of Russian oil, or face higher duties until the war ends. Some EU capitals worry about retaliation or collateral damage to supply chains. Those concerns are valid, but the counter-argument is this: if Russia's war is financed by discounted oil sold to large buyers, then limiting that revenue shortens the war and reduces risk across Europe. The likely compromise is a mix of tougher sanctions enforcement inside the EU and calibrated pressure from the G7, coupling consequences with off-ramps for countries that adjust their behavior. When would results show up? Each sanctions round takes weeks to bite as contracts roll off and cargoes reroute. Banking restrictions and insurer actions can move faster, sometimes within days. Expect a first wave of effect in the 4 to 6 week window with deeper impact over a quarter. Key indicators to watch are Russian export discounts to benchmarks, dark fleet utilization rates, tanker insurance cancellations, components interdicted at EU borders, and the number of entities added to denial lists. For allies, a metric that matters is fewer drones and missiles, less money for parts, and a lower tempo of terror. Inside the EU, Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas has framed the task as squeezing financial flows while keeping unity among 27, and Italy's Antonio Tajani says the next package should bite hardest where money moves. Procedurally, ambassadors are expected to take up the file midweek, with ministers to follow if consensus holds. Here is what to watch in the next 72 hours and how to read the signals without the noise. First, the calendar. If the Commission tables the proposal at the start of the week, look for EU ambassadors to examine it midweek. A quick agreement at ambassador level would indicate narrow disputes and strong alignment with G7 enforcement priorities. A delay would point to carve-outs or technical arguments about scope and definitions. Second, the content clues. Watch for language on the shadow fleet, definitions of high-risk vessels, data sharing protocols with insurers, and penalties for owners and managers who falsify cargo records. Look for added pressure on banks and payment processors that enable procurement networks and on mere linked services that help Russia route transactions. Note any additional dual-use items and new catch-all clauses that let authorities stop suspicious exports even when products are not explicitly listed. Third, coordination. Public readouts from Washington, Brussels, and London often sound bland, but phrasing matters. If you hear joint enforcement tasking, targeted port bans, or enhanced information exchange, that is code for concrete action that raises the odds of interdictions and fines. Fourth, indicators. Beyond headlines, track Russian export discounts relative to Brent or Urals benchmarks, the utilization rate of dark fleet tankers, insurer cancellations in P&I clubs, and the number of new names on EU denial lists. When those move together, enforcement is working. Fifth, politics. Expect domestic debates in a few EU states, but remember that unanimity has held through 18 prior packages. Leaders who voice concerns often still vote yes after securing technical fixes or time-limited exemptions. The center of gravity remains to keep pressure high while protecting European industry and allied cohesion. Sixth, the G7 tariff question. If finance ministers coalesce around a wartime tariff track aimed at China and India, expect a carefully drafted time limit and a review clause tied to measurable changes in Russian oil revenue. Even without full consensus, the debate alone stiffens the spine of sanctions enforcers and signals that loophole shopping will get more expensive. For viewers, the practical takeaway is straightforward. Europe and North America are tightening the screws in ways that reduce Russia's ability to terrorize Ukrainian cities and intimidate Europe. That means more strain on the Kremlin's budget, fewer parts for missiles and drones, and a safer logistics corridor through the EU for Ukraine's defense and recovery. Please subscribe and like to help more people find clear, verified updates. And thank you to all of Ukraine's partners for your continued help and support. Bottom line, credible, coordinated economic pressure compounds, closing evasions, cutting revenue, and shortening the war.